The gavel had not yet fallen on the finest quarter horse in Caldwell, Kansas, when a woman in a dust-covered traveling coat raised her hand and stole the bid right out from under Timothy Norris's fingers. And he stood there in the middle of that sun-baked auction yard in the summer of 1882 with his jaw slack, and his pride considerably more bruised than his wallet. He had been the undisputed king of every livestock auction in Sumner County for going on 6 years. The ranchers knew him. The auctioneers knew him. The old men who leaned against fence posts and chewed tobacco and watched the proceedings with half-closed eyes all knew Timothy Norris. And they all knew that when he set his sights on an animal, it was as good as sold. He was 28 years old, lean and broad-shouldered in the way that came from honest work rather than vanity, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown eyes that had a habit of reading a horse's character the same careful way a preacher reads scripture. He owned a spread of 400 acres just south of Caldwell, a herd of cattle that had survived 2 brutal winters, and a reputation for being the most stubborn bidder between Wichita and the Oklahoma Territory line. He had never, not once in 6 years, been outbid by a woman. The horse in question was a bay stallion named Copperstrike, and Timothy had spotted him 3 days earlier when the livestock trader from Dodge City had rolled into town with his string of animals tied behind a wagon. Copperstrike was 17 hands, deep-chested, with legs like carved wood, and a gait so smooth it looked like water running over flat stone. Timothy had examined every inch of that horse, had run his hands along the stallion's cannon bones and checked his teeth and looked deep into his eyes, and he had walked away certain that this animal would sire the finest working line south of Abilene. He had told himself a price in his head and added $20 to it for safety, and he had arrived at the auction yard that Tuesday morning feeling as settled and confident as a man could feel. He had not accounted for Eudora Atwood. She appeared somewhere between the mule lot and the main bidding ring, and if anyone else noticed her arrival in a particular way, Timothy could not have said so, because he did not notice her himself until her hand went up and her voice cut clean through the noise of the crowd and the dust and the auctioneer's rapid-fire patter with 2 words that landed like a thrown stone in still water. 45, she said. Timothy had just bid 42. He had been expecting silence, or perhaps an old rancher named Hardin Bowles to throw out 43 just to be difficult before backing down. He had not expected a woman's voice, low and clear and entirely without hesitation, to raise the price by $3 in a single breath. He turned to look at her. She was standing about 8 feet to his left, somewhere around his own age or perhaps a year or 2 younger, with dark auburn hair that had been pinned up neatly at some earlier point in the day, but had since developed opinions of its own, a few strands escaping across her temple in the afternoon breeze. Her traveling coat was a deep brown wool, practical rather than decorative, and she wore it like a woman who spent more time outdoors than she did in parlors. Her eyes, when they cut briefly to the side and caught him staring, were a shade of green-gray that reminded him of the prairie sky when a storm was building on the horizon, full of color and not entirely predictable. She looked back at the auctioneer without any particular expression of triumph. Timothy pulled his attention back to where it belonged. He raised his hand. 47. The auctioneer, a compact and cheerful man named Pete Calloway who had the fastest mouth in 3 counties, acknowledged him with a quick nod and kept rolling. 47, 47, do I hear 48, 48 from anywhere in the yard today, 47 going once, 50, said the woman. There was a small sound from the men nearby. Not quite laughter, not quite surprise. Something in between the sound a crowd makes when something happens that they were not expecting to enjoy as much as they suddenly find themselves enjoying it. Timothy took a slow breath. He was not a man who lost his temper at auctions. Losing your temper at an auction was like bleeding in a river. It helped nothing and only drew trouble. He kept his face even and raised his hand again. 53. Pete Calloway was grinning now behind his professional composure, his eyes flickering back and forth between Timothy and the woman, the way a man watches a card game he is not playing. 53 from Mr. Norris, 53 going once, twice, 56. The sound from the crowd was louder this time, and this time it was clearly not silence and it was clearly not disapproval. Several of the older ranchers shifted their weight. Hardin Bowles actually straightened up from where he had been leaning on the fence post, his tobacco pouch forgotten in his hand. Timothy Norris looked at the stallion. He looked at the amount of money in his coat pocket. He did the arithmetic that a man does when his pride is at war with his good sense, and he found, to his considerable discomfort, that his good sense was winning by about $3. He stood still. He did not raise his hand. Pete Calloway waited the professional amount of time, his gavel raised. 56, 56. Do I hear any advance on $56 for this fine animal, this magnificent specimen of horseflesh, this gentleman's dream and every rancher's answer to his breeding problems? He paused. The crowd waited. Timothy stood with his arms at his sides and his jaw set. "Sold," said Pete Calloway, and the gavel came down like a period at the end of a sentence Timothy had not wanted to finish. There was a scattering of applause. There was also, unmistakably, several men laughing. Timothy did not look at the woman. He turned and walked toward the edge of the auction yard, and it was not until he reached the gap in the fence that led out onto the main street of Caldwell that he heard footsteps behind him, quick and purposeful, and a voice say, "Excuse me." He turned around. She was right there, closer than he had expected, carrying a receipt slip in one gloved hand and looking at him with an expression that was composed but not unkind. Up close, the green-gray of her eyes was more complex than he had seen from 8 feet away. There were flecks of something warmer in them, amber or gold, visible in the afternoon light. She was perhaps an inch or two shorter than him, and she stood the way women who have spent time handling animals tend to stand, balanced and ready, with no wasted tension in her posture. "I wanted to say," she began, and then she paused as if she were choosing her words with a care that was not entirely natural to her, "that I understand that was your bidding ground and I walked into the middle of it without introduction, and I don't consider that the ideal way to conduct business." Timothy stared at her. It was, he would later reflect, probably not the most dignified response he had ever produced in a social encounter, but it was genuine. He had been prepared for indifference or for the kind of brittle politeness that precedes a quick exit. He had not been prepared for an apology that was not quite an apology and yet was somehow more gracious than one. "You needed that horse," he said finally. "I did," she agreed. "So did I know," she said. "I saw you with him 3 days ago on the edge of the livestock yard. You were checking his pasterns." He studied her face. "You've been in Caldwell 3 days. Arrived Sunday," she said. "I'm looking at property. There's a quarter section south of town that may suit my purposes, and I needed a good stud before the seller changed his mind about the land." "What purposes?" he asked, and he was aware that the question was more forward than the situation strictly called for, but something in the directness of her manner made him feel that directness was not unwelcome. She met his eyes without any flinching. "I'm establishing a horse breeding operation," she said. "Quarter horses primarily. Working stock for ranches, and eventually for the cavalry remount program if the quality meets their standard." Something shifted in his chest. It was not admiration exactly, or not only admiration. It was recognition, the feeling of meeting someone who speaks your language when you have been speaking alone for a long time. "Timothy Norris," he said, and extended his hand. She shook it firmly, the way a person does when they have been told that shaking hands is a business gesture and have taken the instructions seriously. "Eudora Atwood." "Where are you from, Miss Atwood?" "Mrs.," she said, and then something moved briefly across her face, a shadow that came and went so quickly that he might have imagined it. "Widow. From Lawrence originally. I've been living in Emporia the past 4 years." "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, because the situation called for it and because he meant it, though he had the uncomfortable awareness that there was a part of him that had registered the word widow and filed it somewhere it probably should not have been filed quite yet. She nodded once, accepting the condolence in the way that people do when they have received it often enough that it has become a kind of ritual, meaningful but worn smooth by repetition. "Thank you." They stood at the edge of the auction yard in the June heat, the sounds of the auction continuing behind them, the dry smell of dust and hay and horses surrounding them the way it always did in Caldwell in summer. The main street stretched out behind her, busy with the mid-morning commerce of a cattle town, wagons and horses, and the steady noise of a place that was always in motion. Timothy became aware that he had been standing there longer than was strictly necessary. He became aware also that he did not especially want to walk away from this conversation, which was a sensation he could not fully account for and which he therefore chose not to examine too carefully. "Do that again," he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon. Outbid me," he said. "At the next auction, do it again." She looked at him for a long moment with those storm-colored eyes, and then something happened at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile but was clearly its first cousin. "Why would I do that?" "Because I want to see if you've got the same nerve twice," he said. "And because if you're going to be south of town breeding quarter horses and I'm south of town running cattle, we are going to be neighbors, and I find I'd rather know what my neighbors are made of before they move in." She considered this. "That is a peculiar way to get to know someone." "This is a peculiar town," he said. The almost smile became a real one, briefly and quietly, like a lamp being lit in a far window. "It is that," she said. Then she folded the receipt slip carefully and tucked it into her coat pocket and said, "Good day, Mr. Norris," and walked back into the auction yard. He watched her go. Hardin Bowles materialized at his elbow, which was Hardin Bowles's particular talent, appearing at moments of maximum inconvenience with maximum commentary. "Well," said Hardin in the tone of a man who has just witnessed something of considerable entertainment value, "I have been coming to Pete Calloway's auctions for 19 years, and I have never once seen you stand still." "Go away, Hardin," Timothy said, without any particular heat. "Who is she?" "A neighbor," said Timothy. "Probably." Hardin chewed his tobacco and looked toward the auction yard where Eudora Atwood had disappeared back into the crowd. "Interesting neighbor," he said. "Go away, Hardin," Timothy said again, and this time he said it while already walking, heading back toward where his horse was tied at the post down the street, carrying the somewhat bewildering knowledge that he had just lost the best horse he had seen in 3 years and felt, against all reasonable expectation, considerably less troubled about it than he should have. The property south of town that Eudora Atwood had been looking at turned out to be the old Perkins homestead, a quarter section of good flat grassland with a creek running along its eastern edge, and a serviceable 2-room house that had been empty since old Bill Perkins moved to live with his daughter in Wichita the previous autumn. Timothy knew the land well, had walked its boundaries a dozen times in his own mind during the years when his own spread was expanding, and every neighboring piece of ground looked like an opportunity. He had decided against the Perkins place eventually because the creek ran shallow in August and the house would need considerable work, but for someone starting fresh and willing to build, it was good ground. He learned that she had closed the sale on a Wednesday, 2 days after the auction. He learned it from Pete Calloway, who had learned it from the land office clerk, who had told the barber, who had told essentially everyone else in Caldwell within the same afternoon. This was how information traveled in a town of 3,000 people in the Kansas summer of 1882, and Timothy accepted the intelligence without comment while getting his hair cut, though he noticed that he had sat up slightly straighter in the barber's chair when the information arrived. He gave himself a week before he rode out to the Perkins place with a reasonable excuse. The excuse he settled on was a fence line. There was a stretch of split rail along the northern edge of the Perkins property that abutted the southern edge of his own grazing land, and several of the rails had been knocked loose by cattle over the winter, and he had been meaning to attend to them. It was a legitimate errand. It required him to be on or near the boundary of Eudora Atwood's new property. It was not, he told himself firmly, a pretext. He arrived on a Thursday morning to find that she had already noticed the fence. She was standing at the broken section when he rode up, wearing work trousers tucked into boots and a plain cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hair in a practical braid down her back, examining the fallen rails with the attentive frown of someone who is calculating exactly how much labor a problem is going to require. Copper Strike was visible in the small paddock behind the house, moving with the slow proprietary ease of an animal that has already decided a place belongs to him. She looked up when she heard his horse. "Mr. Norris." Mrs. Atwood," he corrected himself. "I came about the fence." "I assumed someone would," she said. "It's your cattle that knocked it down. Over the winter, likely. I should have checked it sooner." He swung down from the saddle and led his horse to stand. "I have the rails in the wagon." He gestured behind him, where a flatbed wagon with a mule in the traces was waiting on the road. "Shouldn't take more than a few hours." She looked at him steadily for a moment, and he had the impression she was deciding something. "I'll help," she said. "I was planning to repair it myself this week in any case." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," she said. "I want to. It's as much my fence as yours." They worked through the morning side by side, and Timothy discovered several things about Eudora Atwood that the auction had not fully revealed. She was not a woman who worked quietly. She asked questions with the precision of someone who genuinely needed the answers, about the frost patterns in the area, and when the creek dropped in summer, and whether the soil along the southern edge of the property was too heavy for good pasture. She had opinions about fence construction that differed somewhat from his own, and she stated them plainly, without apology but also without aggression, as a person states a position they have thought through and are prepared to defend. She was also, he noticed, careful with the wood. She handled each rail as if she were thinking about the tree it had been, and when one of them split along the grain, she looked at it for a moment with an expression that was briefly and genuinely sorry, the way you are sorry when something breaks that did not need to. He did not remark on any of this. He was not a man who narrated his observations aloud as a general practice, but he stored each thing carefully, the way you store good seed, not knowing quite yet what you intend to plant. When the fence was done and they stood back to look at it, straight and solid in the June light, she said, "Thank you for bringing the rails. I would have had to ride into town for them." "I owed them," he said. "The cattle were mine." "They were," she agreed. She was looking at the fence, not at him, her head tilted slightly the way it had been when she was watching the auction. "I'm going to be putting in a new paddock on the west side of the house. I've got 6 mares coming from Emporia at the end of the month." "Good mares." "Very good mares," she said, and there was a warmth in her voice when she said it that he recognized. It was the voice of a person talking about something they love. "2 of them are daughters of a steel dust horse that was running in East Texas 15 years ago. Good bone, good feet. They'll do well here." She paused, "assuming the grass holds." "It'll hold if you rotate them right," he said. "That north pasture gets better sun. I can show you the patterns if you want. I've been watching this land for years." She turned to look at him then directly, the way she had at the auction. "Why are you being so helpful, Mr. Norris?" The question was not hostile. It was honest, the question of a woman who had learned somewhere in her life that generosity without motive was rarer than it sounded, and who had developed the habit of naming the thing she was uncertain about rather than letting it sit unaddressed. He thought about the truthful answer. The truthful answer was complicated and included things he was not entirely prepared to say aloud yet. The answer he gave was simpler and was also true, just less complete. "Because you know horses," he said, "and because good neighbors make good ranches. Those 2 things don't require any further reason." She held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked back at the fence. "Fair enough," she said. Then in a tone that was lighter, "Do you want coffee?" He did. They sat on the narrow porch of the old Perkins house and drank coffee from tin cups and talked about horses and land and the summer weather, and Timothy found that an hour had passed before he was aware of it, which was not something that happened to him often. He was not generally a man who lost track of time in conversation. He was not generally a man who found himself, on the ride home, turning a conversation over in his mind the way you turn a stone over to see what is underneath it. He found himself doing both. The 6 mares arrived from Emporia on the last Friday of June, in a hired stock car on the morning train, and Timothy happened to be at the depot on unrelated business when they came off the ramp. Eudora was there with a hired hand she had taken on, a quiet young man of about 20 named Josiah Crane, who had been working small ranches in the county for 2 years and came with a solid enough reputation for steadiness. She was watching each horse come down with the focused attention of a person receiving something valuable, checking each animal's legs and eyes and temperament before moving to the next. Timothy watched from a distance, not wanting to intrude. But she saw him and she raised a hand briefly, and he crossed the platform and stood beside her as the 5th mare came down the ramp. "This is the one," she said, meaning the mare that had just arrived, a blood bay with a white star and forelegs that moved like she was measuring every step against a perfect standard. "What's her name?" he asked. "Clara," she said. "She's 8 years old and she's never missed a season. I have records going back 5 years." He ran his eye over the mare with the automatic assessment of long practice. Clara stood quietly at the base of the ramp, ears forward, taking in the new surroundings without alarm. Good temperament, strong quarters. The kind of horse you only find if you know exactly what you are looking for. "She's extraordinary," he said, and he said it without thinking because it was plainly true. Eudora glanced at him sideways with a small expression he was beginning to recognize, a suppressed satisfaction, the look of a person who is pleased to have something they have chosen be recognized. "Yes," she said, "she is." Over the months that followed, the line between neighborliness and friendship blurred in the way that lines tend to blur when 2 people spend enough time in the same space doing the same kind of work. Timothy began stopping at the Atwood property with a frequency that exceeded any reasonable justification based on fence lines or borrowed tools, and Eudora began doing the same in the other direction. Riding over on the bay gelding, she kept for everyday work to ask about the creek level, or the late summer grasses, or whether he knew anyone in town who could shoe a horse with a slightly different angle than standard, because Clara had a tendency to land heavy on the inside of her front hooves. He knew someone. He drove her to meet the farrier, a skilled man named Reuben Acaffer who had come west from Missouri 15 years earlier and had built a reputation in Caldwell for being able to work with difficult horses and uncommon problems. Reuben looked at Clara, asked 3 questions, made 2 adjustments to his tools, and solved the problem in a single session. Eudora shook his hand and paid him a fair price, and then looked at Timothy with an expression of such unguarded delight that he had to look away for a moment, out at the dry street, to give himself somewhere else to put the warmth that had risen in his chest. "You know good people," she said. "So do you," he said, meaning Josiah Crane, who had turned out to be a remarkably capable hand, and meaning also the connections she had made in Caldwell in 4 months faster than some people made in 4 years. She looked at him steadily. "I'm still learning who the good people are out here," she said. "In Lawrence it was easier. I'd known most of those families my whole life." "How long were you married?" he asked, and then immediately felt that he had stepped somewhere he had not been invited. But she did not close down. She looked out at the street instead, and the answer came after a pause that was thoughtful rather than reluctant. "4 years," she said. "His name was Charles. He was a good man. He died of fever in the winter of '78. Another pause. "We had a child, a boy. He came early and did not survive the week." Timothy was quiet for a moment because the moment required it. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it more thoroughly than any condolence he could remember offering. "It was 4 years ago," she said, not dismissing the grief but having made her peace with it in the way that people eventually must. "I stayed in Emporia because Lawrence had too much of both of them everywhere I looked, but Emporia was never quite right either. It was the wrong size, large enough to feel impersonal but not large enough to feel free." She paused. I wanted land. I wanted something that I was building, not inheriting or tending. When I heard about the Perkins property, it felt like the right kind of wrong that sometimes turns into right. He understood what she meant perfectly, which was itself a kind of answer to questions he had been asking himself without fully framing them. "What about you?" she asked. "Have you been married?" "No," he said. "Came close once about 5 years ago. She married a land agent from Topeka instead. I think she made the right choice." He said this without bitterness, because the bitterness had long since worn away into simple acknowledgement. "I have been fairly occupied with the ranch." "That's not the same as not being lonely," she said. The directness of it surprised him, not the content but the willingness to say it. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." They were standing outside Reuben Ackhaffer's livery in the September heat, with Clara on a lead rope between them and the town moving around them in its ordinary way, and it was one of those moments that presents itself with complete ordinariness on its surface while being anything but ordinary underneath. He did not say anything further, neither did she. But something had shifted between them in the way that a creek shifts its channel imperceptibly over time, until one day you look and see that the water is running in a slightly different place, and you cannot quite remember when it changed. The fall auction in October was the second major livestock sale of the year in Caldwell, and Timothy had his eye on a draft cross that would be useful for winter work on the ranch. He arrived early, staked out his position near the front of the ring, and was running his calculations when he became aware, with a certainty that had no particular logical basis, that Eudora Atwood was somewhere in the crowd behind him. He did not turn around. He waited. The draft cross came up in the second lot of the morning, a broad-backed gray with good temperament and the deep chest that meant endurance. Timothy had his number in mind. The bidding opened at 20 and climbed steadily, and when it reached 28, Timothy raised his hand and the auctioneer acknowledged him with the ease of long familiarity. "28 from Mr. Norris," said Pete Calloway. "Do I hear 30? 30 for this fine draft horse, good working animal, fine conformation, $30 anywhere in this yard today." "30," said a voice to his left. He turned his head. She was standing exactly where she had been standing in June, about 8 feet away, and she was watching the animal in the ring with the same focused attention she had turned on Copper Strike 4 months earlier. She was wearing a heavier coat now, the Kansas autumn having arrived with its characteristic lack of ceremony, and her hair was pinned up more successfully today, though one strand was already in transit toward her cheek in the morning breeze. She did not look at him. He felt something move through him that was equal parts amusement and something warmer and less easily named. 32, he said. There was a ripple in the crowd. People who had been at the June auction remembered. People who had only heard about it were already leaning forward. 35, said Eudora. 36, he said, before Pete Calloway had even finished the sentence. 38. 40. She paused for the first time, and he permitted himself to glance at her. She was looking at the horse with the expression of a person revising their calculations, and he had a moment of perfectly clear understanding that she had not come to this auction intending to buy this particular horse, or not primarily. He had not been certain of this until this moment, but the certainty arrived now with the weight of fact. She raised her hand. 42. He let the silence stretch for a count of 5. Long enough that Pete Calloway's gavel began its preliminary lift. Then he said 43 and watched the corner of her mouth. There it was, the almost smile. 43, said Pete Calloway. $43. Do I hear any advance at all? 43 going once, 43 going twice. Eudora put her hand down. The gavel fell. Timothy turned to look at her fully. You let me win, he said. I decided I didn't need a draft horse, she said, with an expression of complete composure that did not quite extend to her eyes. You didn't want one to begin with, he said. The almost smile became more definite. I wanted to see if you had nerve twice, she said, repeating his words from June with a precision that made it clear she had not forgotten a single one of them. He looked at her for a long moment in the October morning, with the auction yard noise around them and the dust rising from the ring and the particular quality of fall light in Kansas that turns everything golden and slightly melancholy. "Have supper with me," he said. She did not look away, and she did not hesitate for very long. "All right," she said. They went to the hotel dining room because it was the most respectable place in Caldwell, and they were both people who understood that in a town of 3,000 people in 1882, how things appeared mattered in ways that affected practical life. They sat across from each other at a table by the window and ordered from a menu written on a chalkboard, and talked for 3 hours about things that ranged from horse breeding to the economics of the cattle trade to what Eudora remembered of Lawrence before the war had torn it apart, and what Timothy remembered of arriving in Caldwell at 22 with $200, a good horse, and an absolute determination to build something. She told him about her father, who had been a veterinarian in Lawrence, and who had taught her everything she knew about animals before he died of a heart complaint when she was 17. She told him about Charles more this time, the small particular details that make a person real, that he had been funny in a quiet, understated way, that he had been a school teacher, that he had read to her on winter evenings from whatever book he happened to be working through at the time, that his death had been so sudden, a fever that turned severe in less than a week, that she had felt for a long time afterward as if the world had changed its rules without informing her. He told her things he had not told anyone in a long time, or perhaps ever in quite this way, about his father, a difficult man who had run a farm in Indiana with a rigidity that left no room for error, and who had died when Timothy was 20, leaving him a $200 inheritance, and an absolute determination never to be rigid in the same way. About the first years in Caldwell, the loneliness of them and the freedom of them together, the way building something from nothing was both the hardest thing he had ever done and the most clarifying. About what he wanted the ranch to become, which was something more than just profitable, something that would last and improve the land rather than diminish it. She listened to all of it with the quality of attention that is rarer than intelligence and more valuable, the kind that makes the speaker feel that what they are saying is worth saying. When they walked out of the hotel into the cool October night, their breath visible in the lamplight, she said, "I should get back. Josiah will have fed the horses, but I want to check Clara." "I'll ride with you," he said, "as far as the boundary." They rode together through the October dark, the horses comfortable with each other from months of proximity, and at the fence line that divided their two properties they stopped and sat in the saddle for a moment with the prairie stretching out dark and wide around them, and the stars enormous overhead, the way they always are in Kansas away from town, filling up the sky with a density that feels almost overwhelming. "Timothy," she said, which was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice in the dark was something he felt rather than heard. "Yes," he said. "I'm glad you followed me outside in June," she said. "At the auction." "So am I," he said. She looked at him for a moment in the starlight, and then she turned her horse toward home. He watched her ride away until she was a shape in the darkness, and then a sound, and then nothing. Just the prairie and the stars and the distant light of her house window, and he sat there longer than he needed to before turning toward his own place, feeling something in his chest that was not quite settled and was not at all unpleasant. The first real difficulty came in November. It came in the form of a man named Ward Calhoun, who arrived in Caldwell from Wichita on the northbound stage on a Tuesday morning, and presented himself at the land office with a claim that there was a dispute regarding the title of the Perkins property. Calhoun was in his 40s, well dressed in the way of men who want to be mistaken for more successful than they are, with the particular smoothness of someone who had spent years moving through legal gray areas without quite crossing into black. He claimed to represent the interests of a Perkins cousin who had, according to him, been improperly excluded from the original sale. Timothy heard about this on Wednesday from the land office clerk, the same chain of information that had brought him news of Eudora's purchase in June. He rode to her property that afternoon. She was already in town when he arrived, and Josiah told him so, and he found her at the land office itself, standing at the counter with her sale documents spread before her, and an expression on her face that was controlled in the way a fire is controlled when you have adequate water capable of becoming otherwise very quickly. Ward Calhoun was not present. The county registrar, a cautious man named Aldous Webb, was explaining in careful terms that while her paperwork appeared entirely in order, a formal challenge had been filed and would require a legal review period of 30 days before he could confirm the title without reservation. 30 days, said Eudora, in a tone of perfect flatness. I'm sorry, Mrs. Atwood, said Aldous Webb, who genuinely appeared to be. It's the procedure. If the challenge has no merit, and I have no reason to think it does, the title will be confirmed without any further complication. And in 30 days, she said, my mares may or may not have a legal paddock to stand in, and the construction I have planned for the winter barn will need to be halted because I cannot begin permanent structures on a property whose title is under review. That is the legal position, unfortunately. Timothy stepped up to the counter beside her. She glanced at him, surprised, and he said to Aldous Webb, has Calhoun provided documentation of this cousin's claim? A letter, said Aldous. Notarized in Wichita. A letter from a notary in Wichita, Timothy said, in the tone of a man cataloging the precise weight of evidence. Not from a court, not from an attorney, a notarized letter. That is correct, said Aldous, who now looked as though he wished to be elsewhere. Does it identify the specific basis of the claim, whether it alleges fraud in the original sale, improper exclusion from the estate, or a prior lien? Aldous Webb blinked. You know land law, Mr. Norris. My attorney does, said Timothy. I suggest we ask him. The attorney was a man named Samuel Phelps, who maintained an office above the hardware store and who had handled Timothy's property transactions for 6 years, with a combination of competence and blunt honesty that Timothy valued. Samuel Phelps looked at the documents, read the letter of claim, cleaned his spectacles, read the letter again, and then said in the tone of a man who has just identified something that does not warrant serious concern but does warrant a careful response, this is a nuisance claim. It is designed to delay and to extract a settlement. Can it be defeated? Eudora asked. Comfortably, said Samuel Phelps. The Perkins estate was properly settled in county court 14 months ago. There is no surviving claim from any heir. This cousin, if he exists, was notified at that time by the legal requirement of public notice in the Caldwell newspaper and made no objection. The 30-day review period is technically mandatory, but I can file a motion to expedite on the grounds that the challenge lacks any basis in recorded law. He looked over his spectacles. It will cost you $12 in filing fees. File it, said Eudora. File it, agreed Timothy. They walked out of Samuel Phelps's office into the gray November street, and Eudora let out a long breath that she had clearly been containing. Ward Calhoun, she said, with a precision that was not quite contempt but was its close neighbor. Did he really think a letter was sufficient? He thought you might not know the procedure well enough to fight it, Timothy said. He may also have thought you were alone. She looked at him. I am not alone, she said. No, he agreed. You are not. The claim was disposed of in 18 days. Samuel Phelps filed his motion. The county court reviewed it with the speed of a legal body confronted with something that was obviously a waste of its time, and Ward Calhoun departed Caldwell on the southbound stage without having achieved anything except the firm establishment of his reputation as a person not to do business with. The title of the Perkins property was confirmed in Eudora Atwood's name without reservation, and construction on the winter barn began the following Monday. Timothy lent her 3 men from his own crew for the framing, because the barn needed to be closed in before the December weather arrived, and Josiah, capable as he was, could not do it alone in the time available. She objected once briefly, and he said, It's lending, not giving. You can send them back in spring with twice the work hours and we'll call it even." And she looked at him for a moment and said, "Agreed." And that was the end of the objection. The winter was cold, as Kansas winters are, and the work on both properties slowed to the maintenance pace that the cold months require: feeding and watering and watching and mending, the patient repetitive labor that keeps animals alive through the hard months. Timothy and Eudora fell into a rhythm of visiting that had the character of something settled and expected rather than something deliberate, taking turns riding over to check that the other's animals had come through a cold snap all right, sharing information about which stretches of the creek were frozen and where the drifts were deepest along the roads. He began having supper with her on Friday evenings. This happened gradually, and he was not sure afterward which Friday had been the first one where it became an expectation rather than an invitation. But at some point in December he became aware that by Thursday afternoon he was thinking about Friday evening, and he thought that this was probably telling him something he had known for some time. She was a different kind of company in her own home than she was in other settings. She was still direct and still thoughtful, but there was a relaxation to her that he had not seen in public contexts, a willingness to be funny that surprised him the first time and delighted him every time after. She had dry humor, the kind that lands quietly and keeps landing, and she had a way of observing the small absurdities of life. A horse with a contrary personality, the perpetual optimism of the Caldwell newspaper about the cattle market, Josiah Crane's heroic but unsuccessful attempts to bake bread, that made him laugh in the particular way you laugh when something is both funny and completely true. He found himself telling her things about his days that he had never had anyone to tell before. Not dramatic things. Small things. A problem with a gate latch that had taken him half a day to solve. A conversation with a cattle buyer that had left him annoyed and then amused. A moment that morning when he had seen a pair of hawks riding the wind above the south pasture, and had stopped working for a full minute just to watch them. These things, which had no audience in his usual life, had an audience now, and the experience of being listened to was something he had not fully known he was missing. It was on a Friday in February, during the worst cold snap of the winter, that things moved from where they were to somewhere else. He had ridden over in the late afternoon with a concern about a section of her pasture fence that he had noticed leaning in the wind, and they had dealt with it quickly while the light lasted, and then come inside to the warmth of her kitchen. She was making coffee, and there was bread on the table, real bread, not Josiah's earnest failures, and the lamplight in the small kitchen was the warm amber color of lamplight in winter when everything outside is dark and cold, and a lit window is its own kind of argument for the value of being indoors. He was sitting at the kitchen table watching her move from the stove to the counter with the ease of a person in her own space, and she was telling him about a letter she had received from a horse breeder in Colorado who had heard about her operation and was interested in a possible arrangement for the following breeding season, and her voice had the warm, particular energy it always had when she talked about her horses. And he was listening to both the words and the voice, and the lamplight was doing what lamplight does in winter kitchens, and he became aware with a clarity that he could not account for precisely that he was in love with Eudora Atwood. Not falling into love or approaching love, or beginning to feel something that might become love. He was simply already completely in love with her, and the feeling was so certain and so settled that it felt less like an arrival and more like a recognition of something that had been true for some time. He did not say this. He was not a man who said large things out loud in unguarded moments without having thought them through. He stored it instead the way he stored good seed, knowing its value and waiting for the right season. She set the coffee in front of him and sat down across the table and said, "What?" "Nothing," he said. She looked at him with those storm-colored eyes. "You have an expression." "I have a face," he said. "That's all." She held his gaze for a moment, and something moved in her own expression, a flicker of awareness, a slight quickening of attention, the way a person looks when they have heard something they were not entirely expecting and are deciding how to receive it. Then she looked down at her coffee and said, "The Colorado breeder is sending photographs of his stock. I want to see the legs before I agree to anything." "Smart," he said. "Always," she said, and the lightness in it was deliberate, the lightness you use to walk carefully across uncertain ice. He let it lie. He was patient by nature and by practice, and he understood that Eudora Atwood was a woman who had loved someone and lost him, and had rebuilt herself from that loss with considerable care, and that rushing her was not only unkind but would be strategically stupid, because what he wanted was not a moment but a life. He could wait. He waited through the rest of February and through March, and through the first weeks of April, visiting and working alongside her, and having his Friday suppers, and watching her operation develop with the kind of competent momentum that he had known from the beginning it would have. The 6 mares had all been confirmed in foal to Copper Strike, whose value as a stud was becoming apparent to anyone who looked carefully at the way he moved, and the way he made other horses want to move. She had 2 inquiries for boarding arrangements from local ranchers who wanted to put their mares to him, and she handled both negotiations with the combination of thoroughness and easy confidence that he had come to understand was simply how she operated. The Colorado arrangement came through in April. She told him about it over supper, her face alight in the way it got when something she had worked toward was realized, and he said, "Show me the photographs." And she spread them on the table, and they leaned over them together, their heads nearly touching in the lamplight, and she was pointing out the confirmation points she liked, and he was nodding and asking questions. And at some point he became aware that she had stopped talking and that they were both looking at the same photograph, but neither of them was actually seeing it. He looked up. She was looking at him. The kitchen was very quiet. "Eudora," he said. "Yes," she said, which was not an answer to anything he had said, but was an answer nonetheless. He reached across the table and took her hand, which was warm from the coffee cup and steady in his, and he said, "I am going to tell you something, and I want you to hear all of it before you say anything." She nodded. "I have been in love with you since some time before Christmas," he said. "I don't know exactly when. I think it may have been earlier than that, but I am a slow man about some things. I know that you are building something here that belongs entirely to you, and I have no intention of asking you to stop building it or to make it smaller than it wants to be. I am not asking you to give anything up. I am asking you to consider whether there might be a way of adding something, and whether what I am might be worth adding." He stopped. The lamplight moved. Somewhere outside, the April wind was doing what April wind does on the Kansas prairie, which is remind you that the world is large and in motion and indifferent to individual concerns. She looked at him for a long moment with her hand in his, and he watched her face carefully, because her face was usually more honest than her words when she was in uncertain territory. And what he saw, there was not uncertainty exactly, but something more like the particular courage required to trust after loss. "I have known," she said carefully, "for some time that my feelings about you were not going to remain manageable in the way I had been managing them." "That is the most careful way I have ever heard anyone describe a feeling," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. "I am a careful woman." "You are," he said. "You are also the bravest person I know who calls themselves careful." Something opened in her face, the way a room opens when the shutters come back and the light comes in all at once. "Timothy," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you too," she said. "I have been rather frustratingly aware of that fact for longer than I would have preferred to admit." He laughed quietly, the laugh that is not humor exactly but something more like relief and joy together. He brought her hand up and pressed it against his lips, and she looked at him with her storm-colored eyes full of that warm amber he had first seen in the sunlight at the auction yard. And it was one of those moments that settle into a person and stay there, the way a stone settles into a riverbed and becomes part of the landscape. He asked her to marry him in May properly, with the words in order and a ring that had belonged to his mother, a small gold band with a single garnet, nothing extravagant but real. He asked her on the porch of her house in the evening, with the prairie going gold in the sunset, and copper strike moving in his paddock and Clara grazing with the slow contentment of a well-kept horse. And she stood beside him and looked at the ring for a moment, and then looked at him, and said yes in a voice that had no hesitation in it and all the certainty in the world. They were married in July, in the small Methodist church on the east side of Caldwell, on a morning that managed to be both hot and beautiful in the way that July mornings in Kansas sometimes are. Eudora wore a cream-colored dress that she had ordered from a dressmaker in Wichita, plain and well-made, and nothing fussy, and she carried prairie wildflowers that she had picked herself from the field along the creek that morning at dawn, because she said she wanted something that was actually from here and actually alive. Timothy wore his best suit, which Hardin Bowles had made him have pressed at considerable insistence, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle on her own arm, because there was no family present to walk with her. Her father was long gone and she had no brothers, and she had said simply that she was a woman who had walked on her own for long enough to know she could do it, and saw no reason to pretend otherwise for ceremony. And he thought that watching her walk toward him was one of the finest things he had ever seen. Samuel Phelps attended. Reuben Acaffer attended. Pete Calloway attended and made a joke in his congratulatory handshake about how he had known it would come to this since June of the previous year, and Timothy told him to mind his business, and Pete Calloway laughed so hard he had to hold his hat. Josiah Crane attended and stood near the back of the church, looking quietly pleased in the way of people who have watched something develop and feel a proprietary satisfaction in its conclusion. Hardin Bowles attended and cried, which surprised everyone including Hardin Bowles. They did not take a wedding journey because there was no convenient time to leave two ranches unattended in July, and neither of them minded this in the slightest. They went home to her house, which they had decided would be their house for the present, while Timothy's larger house was expanded to accommodate a shared life, and they ate supper on the porch and watched the summer dark come in and listened to the prairie sounds, and were, both of them, entirely and genuinely happy in the simple specific way that people are happy when the right things have come together in the right order. The question of the two properties and how to manage them together was a practical one that they had begun discussing before the wedding and continued discussing after it, with the same businesslike directness they brought to everything else. The conclusion they reached by August was that the ranching operation and the horse breeding operation would remain distinct but mutually supportive, sharing labor during peak seasons, sharing grazing land strategically, and presenting themselves to buyers and breeders as related but separately accountable ventures. This arrangement had the advantage of preserving what each of them had built individually while creating efficiencies that neither of them could have achieved alone. Timothy contributed knowledge of cattle markets and local land patterns. Eudora contributed her breeding expertise and the Colorado connection, which was developing into something substantial, and her ability to negotiate with the kind of calm precision that consistently resulted in terms that were better than the other party had intended to offer. Their first autumn together brought a particular kind of richness that Timothy had not expected, not the dramatic richness of large events, but the daily richness of being known, of having someone across the breakfast table who asked the right questions and understood the answers, of riding out to check the herd in the morning and having company that did not require him to explain himself, of returning home to lamplight and the smell of something cooking and the sound of her voice in the other room. He told her this one evening in October, clumsily, because he was not practiced at saying such things. She put down what she was mending and looked at him with an expression of undefended tenderness that still, months into their marriage, had the power to stop him in the middle of whatever he was doing. "I know," she said. "I feel it too. I don't know what I was doing with myself before," he said. "You were building something," she said. "Something worth coming home to." He reached across and took her hand, which was by now one of the most natural gestures in his life. "We built it," he said. She turned her hand and laced her fingers through his. "We did," she said. The first foals from Copper Strike's line arrived the following spring, in the March and April of 1884, and they were everything Eudora had predicted they would be. Strong-legged and level-tempered, with good bone and the smooth, efficient movement that was the signature of a steel-dust bloodline working at its best. The first one born was a colt, dark bay with a narrow blaze, who arrived in the early morning while Timothy sat in the straw beside Eudora waiting, both of them tired and quiet. And when the colt finally found his feet and stood, blinking, in the lantern light, she made a sound that was not quite a word, just a small breathless exhalation of joy. And Timothy put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they watched the new animal figure out the miracle of standing up together. She named the colt First Light, which was what she had said it was when he arrived. Timothy told her this was going to be a difficult name to put on livestock sale documents, and she said she was aware of that, and intended to keep him anyway. First Light stayed. The Colorado breeder, whose name was James Whitmore, visited in May to see the foal crop in person, and left with a standing arrangement for 2 mares to go to his stud the following year, and an expression of someone whose good estimation of a business associate has been significantly upgraded. He also brought with him a letter from a cavalry remount agent in Fort Leavenworth, who had heard about the Atwood breeding operation through a mutual connection, and was interested in a formal evaluation visit. Eudora read this letter twice at the breakfast table and then looked up at Timothy with an expression of such pure and unguarded elation that he set down his coffee and said, "Tell me," she told him. He listened to all of it, the detail and the significance and what it might mean for the operation in the years ahead, and when she was finished he said, "I knew it from the day you stepped off that auction platform." "You did not," she said. "Not the cavalry specifically," he admitted, "but the rest of it. That you were going to build something extraordinary." She shook her head slightly, smiling, in the way she did when she thought he was being excessive. But her eyes were bright and she said quietly, "I couldn't have done it this fast without you." "You could have," he said. "It would just have taken longer and been lonelier." "Both of those things matter," she said. The cavalry remount agent arrived in August, a methodical man named Captain Horace Blaine who examined horses with the dispassionate thoroughness of someone who had seen a great many animals and was not easily impressed. He was at the Atwood property for 2 days. He examined every animal in the breeding herd, asked questions about feeding and conditioning practices, reviewed the breeding records that Eudora kept with the meticulous care of a scientist, and watched the spring foal crop move in the paddock for a full morning without saying very much. On the afternoon of the second day, he said to Eudora, "The quality here is above what I expected." "I know," said Eudora. Captain Blaine looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who is recalibrating. Then he said, "I can offer you a provisional contract for 10 horses in the spring of '85, subject to inspection at time of delivery." 12, said Eudora. "And I want the inspection protocol in writing before the contract is signed so there are no surprises at delivery." Captain Blaine looked at her for another moment. 12, he said, "and the inspection protocol in writing." "Agreed," said Eudora. Timothy had been standing near the paddock fence during this exchange, close enough to hear and far enough back not to intrude, and after Captain Blaine walked away to his horse he came up beside her and said nothing, just stood there, and she looked up at him with a satisfaction so deep and complete that it was almost like rest. 12 horses for the cavalry," she said. "I heard," he said. "This is what I came out here for," she said. "This is exactly what I came out here for." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him in the August afternoon, and they looked out at the paddock where the foals were moving in the golden light, and the prairie stretched out beyond them wide and open, and full of the particular kind of possibility that lives in a place that has been worked with care and intention. In the autumn of 1884, Eudora told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen on a Wednesday morning, The way she told him most things, directly and without preface, looking at him across the breakfast table with an expression that was trying to be composed and was almost succeeding. He got up from his chair and came around the table and held her, which was not something he thought about doing but simply did, and she held on to him with a tightness that told him that this was joyful and also frightening, because she had done this before and knew what could be lost. "I am going to be right here," he said, quietly, meaning it as a fact rather than a promise, the way you state a fact about something that is not going to change. "I know you are," she said. He brought Dr. Annabelle Hollies from Wichita, a physician who had been recommended by Samuel Phelps's wife as the best doctor for women's care in southern Kansas, a woman in her 40s who had been practicing medicine since before it was entirely acceptable for women to do so, and who had the particular competence of someone who has spent decades being better than the people who doubted her. Dr. Hollies came to Caldwell 4 times during the pregnancy, and each time she left Eudora with the same assessment: everything was progressing as it should. The child, a boy, was born in the first week of June 1885, on a night when the prairie was full of fireflies, and the air smelled of rain that was coming from the west. He arrived healthy and loud, with a voice that hardened Bowles, who was outside waiting with the other neighbors who had gathered without being invited in the way communities do at such moments, said he could hear from the road. He was dark-haired and had his mother's eyes from the first day, that complex green-gray that would deepen as he grew. They named him William Charles Norris, William for no particular ancestor, simply because it suited him. Charles for Eudora's first husband, because she said that grief and love are not mutually exclusive, and that Charles had been a good man who deserved to be remembered, and Timothy had agreed without reservation, because he understood that loving someone well means accepting all of them, including the history that came before you. Josiah Crane, who had by this point been with the horse breeding operation for 3 years, and had grown from a quiet, capable hand to the person Eudora trusted most on the property after Timothy, was the one who rode to town to tell Pete Calloway, because Pete Calloway was the most efficient distributor of information in Caldwell, and telling him was equivalent to telling everyone. By the following morning, the whole town knew, and Mrs. Webb from the land office brought a basket of preserves, and Reuben Acaffer sent a small carved horse that he had made himself, smooth and beautiful, which Eudora placed on the windowsill of the baby's room where the light could find it. William Charles Norris was a good baby, in the sense that no baby is entirely good, but some babies are considerably more forgiving than others. He had his mother's focus and his father's patience, which Timothy thought was probably the best combination of their qualities, and hoped would serve the boy well in whatever life he chose to build. Eudora was back in the paddock checking on the horses 10 days after the birth, which Dr. Hollies had initially objected to, and then acknowledged was probably reasonable given the patient's evident determination and the horse's evident need of attention. Timothy had made the mistake of suggesting she might want to rest another week, and she had looked at him with an expression so precisely calibrated between affection and warning that he had immediately agreed that she knew best. The cavalry contract was fulfilled in the spring of 1885, 12 horses delivered to Fort Leavenworth on time and in excellent condition, and Captain Blaine sent a letter afterward that used the word exemplary twice, which Eudora read aloud at supper, and then folded and put away with careful hands. The following year's contract was for 18 horses, and the year after that for 24, and by 1887, the Atwood breeding operation had a reputation that extended well beyond Sumner County. She never stopped going to the auctions. This was something Timothy understood and had never, even once, suggested should change. Auctions were where she read the market, where she tracked bloodlines, where she maintained the network of connections that kept her informed and her operation competitive. He attended when his own business required it, and sometimes when it did not. In the fall of 1887, at the October auction, the finest young mare Timothy had seen since Clara came through the bidding ring. She was a 3-year-old sorrel from a Colorado ranch, 16 hands, with an intelligence in her eye and a refinement of movement that spoke of serious, careful breeding over several generations. She was exactly what the Atwood operation needed for the next phase of development, and both Timothy and Eudora knew it. They had decided, over supper the week before, that Eudora would bid on her. He stood in his usual spot near the front of the ring and watched Pete Calloway work the crowd and felt the entirely pleasant anticipation of a joke that has a good ending. The mare came in and the crowd stilled slightly, the way it always does when an animal of real quality enters a ring and the people who know horses feel it before they can name it. The bidding opened at 30 and climbed. Eudora was standing 8 feet to his left, which was where she always stood. They had not planned this, or not precisely. It had simply become their arrangement without discussion, the way many of their best arrangements had through instinct and repetition. He raised his hand. 40. She raised hers. 43. 45, he said. 48, she said. Pete Calloway was grinning so hard he was having difficulty maintaining his professional neutrality. The crowd was completely silent. Several people who had been at the June auction of 1882, who had watched this exact dynamic from the beginning, were looking at each other with expressions of deep satisfaction. 50, said Timothy. 53, said Eudora. He looked at her. She was watching the mare in the ring, not him, but there was that quality in her stillness that he knew, the contained amusement, the warmth she kept close to herself in public settings. He thought about the kitchen in February 5 years ago, and the horses' photographs on the table, and the lamplight, and the prairie wind outside. He thought about their son, 2 years old now and already deeply interested in horses, and already possessed of his mother's ability to walk into a paddock and have every animal turn toward him like flowers turning toward the sun. He thought about the morning of their wedding and the cream dress with the wildflowers from the creek. He put his hand down. 53 going once, said Pete Calloway, in a tone of someone concluding a ceremony. 53 going twice, he raised his hand. 54. There was a sound from the crowd that was not quite laughter, and not quite anything else, just the sound of a community watching something it loves. Eudora turned her head and looked at him fully, directly, and she was smiling in the way she almost never smiled in public, openly and without reserve, and the storm-colored eyes were warm and clear and completely unguarded, and he thought that if he had every auction in Kansas between now and the end of his life, he would choose to lose every one of them to her. 56, she said. The gavel came down. He walked over to her and she turned to face him, and around them the auction yard went back to its ordinary noise and motion, and he said quietly, so only she could hear, "Do that again." She looked up at him with the wild-flowering cream dress expression, the one she saved for him alone, and said, "Every time." That mare, whose name turned out to be Rosalind, and who proved over the following years to be everything her movement had promised, sired a line of horses that became known throughout the territory, and the Atwood breeding operation, which Timothy quietly and consistently referred to as Eudora's in all conversations, because it was hers and had always been hers, and he felt no need to append his name to something she had built, became in time one of the finest working horse operations in the state of Kansas. Josiah Crane married a young woman from Caldwell named Margaret in 1888 and stayed on as the operation's head wrangler, and he and Margaret built a small house on the north edge of the property with Eudora's blessing and a very fair wage arrangement that Timothy had negotiated on both their behalves, since Eudora's instinct was to be too generous and Timothy's instinct was to make sure the arrangement was also sustainable. The result was something all 4 of them were satisfied with. William Charles turned 3 in the June of 1888, and Eudora discovered in August that she was expecting again. This time she told Timothy in the paddock, watching Rosalind move in the morning light, and he laughed out loud, the big genuine laugh that Eudora privately considered one of the finest things about him, and picked her up and turned around once and set her down, and she said, "I am not a foal," in a tone that was pretending to be more severe than it was, and he said, "No, you are considerably more valuable," and she laughed too. Their daughter arrived in March of 1889, small and pink and furious about the entire enterprise of being born, with a disposition that indicated from the first week that she intended to have opinions about everything. They named her Rose for Rosalind, because Eudora said that horse had been a turning point and she wanted the year remembered. Timothy added Josephine for no reason he could entirely articulate except that it sounded right with her face, and Rose Josephine Norris grew into a child who was already, at 18 months, attempting to climb the paddock fence to get to the horses, which was deeply inconvenient and also deeply characteristic. The years gathered themselves, as years will, into a body of time that had texture and weight and meaning. There were good seasons and hard seasons. A dry summer in 1890 that required careful management of water and pasture. A cattle illness in 1890, one that cost Timothy 10 animals, and a sleepless month before the rest of the herd was confirmed clear. There was a business dispute with a buyer from Texas who attempted to renegotiate a horse contract after delivery, which Eudora handled with a phone call, the telephone having arrived at the Caldwell Exchange in 1890, which was a development she had adopted with practical enthusiasm, to Samuel Phelps, who resolved it in her favor within a week. There was the death of old Hardin Bowles in the winter of 1892, who went quietly in his sleep and was mourned by more people than he had ever known were paying attention, and whose funeral Timothy attended with a grief that surprised him with its depth. There were the ordinary daily things, which were not ordinary at all when you looked at them closely. Morning coffee and the sound of the children. The Friday evening suppers that were no longer an event but simply the way Friday evenings were. Riding together along the boundary fence in the late afternoon when the light was low, and the prairie had that particular quality it got in certain seasons, like something vast was resting. Sitting on the porch after the children were in bed, talking about everything and nothing, or not talking at all because some silences are not empty. Reuben Acaffer expanded his livery in 1891, and Timothy helped him with the framing the same way Eudora had helped him with the barn in their first winter, and Reuben carved a second small horse for Rose Josephine's windowsill that matched the one William Charles had in his room. The community of Caldwell was not without its difficulties and its injustices. A black man who owned a successful business in 1890s Kansas navigated a world that was not uniformly willing to acknowledge his competence or his dignity, and both Timothy and Eudora were aware of this, and said so plainly when it was relevant, and used what standing they had to be useful when usefulness was possible, which was not always enough but was not nothing. William Charles, at 7 years old, decided he was going to be a horse doctor like his great-grandfather, and announced this to the family at Sunday supper, with a seriousness that made everyone at the table take it seriously in return. Eudora looked at her son with an expression that Timothy recognized from the paddock, the expression she had when she saw something that was going to be exceptional, and said, "Good," in a tone that made it sound like a foundation being laid. By the fall of 1892, the Atwood breeding operation had fulfilled 9 annual contracts with the cavalry remount program, had sold horses to ranches in 5 states and 2 territories, and had been written up in the Kansas Farmers Weekly in an article that called Eudora Norris. She had kept Atwood professionally, for continuity, but was Norris in all other respects, the foremost breeder of working quarter horses in the southern Kansas region. She read the article once, set it aside, and went out to check on Rosalind, who was in late pregnancy and whose comfort she considered more immediately important than any publication. But Timothy found the article later and smoothed it carefully and put it in the desk drawer where they kept the important papers, between the deed to the combined property and William Charles's birth record, and the letter from Captain Blaine that used the word exemplary twice. On a warm evening in the October of 1892, 10 years and a few months after the afternoon when he had followed her out of an auction yard and told her to do it again, Timothy and Eudora sat on the porch of the house they had expanded together over the years. The original Perkins two-room structure, now a comfortable four-room home with a proper kitchen, and a porch that ran the full length of the south wall, looking out at the property that bore the marks of a decade of careful work. The paddocks were solid and well-maintained. The breeding barn stood strong against the fall sky. The creek ran along the eastern edge with the good water level that a generous summer had provided, and the horses moved in the late light with the quality of movement that Eudora had been working toward since before she arrived in Caldwell, easy and powerful and beautiful. William Charles was inside doing his lessons with the focused intensity that characterized everything he did. Rose Josephine was in the paddock with Josiah, who had given up trying to keep her out of it and had instead begun teaching her, at age 3.5, the correct way to approach a horse, which was at least safer than attempting to enforce a prohibition. 10 years, Eudora said, not to the heir but to him. More or less, he said. She turned to look at him in the October evening light. She was 37 years old and she was more beautiful to him than she had been at the auction in 1882, not because of the absence of years but because of their presence, because the face he saw was a face he knew entirely, with all of its expressions and all of the knowledge of what each one meant, and knowing it this well was a different and deeper kind of beauty than not knowing it at all. "Are you content?" she asked. He considered this, as he had been taught by knowing her to consider questions rather than simply answering them. "I am not sure content is the right word," he said. "It suggests stillness." "What's the right word?" He thought about Copper Strike in the paddock and the June auction and the storm-colored eyes and the first fence and the kitchen in February with the lamplight and the photographs, and the day their son was born and every Friday evening and the way she laughed and the way she argued and the way she handled horses and the way she had walked down the aisle of that church in cream and wildflowers. "Full," he said. "Complete. Like something that was being built and is now built but still good to be in." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the property. Then she said, "First Light needs a new companion in his paddock. He's been difficult with the younger horses." "Eudora," he said, "yes. I just told you something romantic." "I know you did," she said, "and I received it, and now I'm telling you about First Light because that is also my life and both things are true at the same time." He looked at her. She looked at him. The corner of her mouth was doing what it had been doing for 10 years. That almost smile, that was the first thing he had ever truly noticed about her. And he thought that he would watch that corner of her mouth with considerable attention and satisfaction for whatever years remained to him, and that this was not a resigned kind of love but the most awake and alive kind, the kind that notices everything about a person because every detail is worth noticing. "What kind of companion does he need?" he asked. "An older mare," she said, "settled, not easily impressed, someone who won't put up with his nonsense." "I know someone like that," he said. She looked at him fully, and the almost smile became a real one, the open, warm, real smile that still had the power it had always had, and she said, "So do I," and leaned her head against his shoulder. The prairie evening came in around them in the way it always did, wide and quiet and enormous, the sky going from gold to rose to that deep dark blue that seems to have more depth than color. And the horses moved in the paddock, and the children's voices came from inside the house, and the creek ran along the eastern edge of the land they had built together, and Eudora Atwood Norris, who had arrived in Caldwell on a Sunday in 1882 with a traveling coat and the nerve to outbid a man and the vision to build something from open ground, sat on her porch beside the man who had followed her outside and asked her to do it again. And they were both, completely and without reservation, exactly where they were supposed to be. Inside, William Charles pushed back from his lessons and went to the window to look at the horses before bed. the way he did every evening, and saw his parents on the porch below, and stored the image of them with the careful instinct of a child who understands, not yet in words but already in something deeper, that he is witnessing something worth remembering. Rose Josephine came in from the paddock with hay in her hair and Josiah behind her saying something patient about hand placement, and she marched past her brother with great purpose, and announced to no one in particular that she had pet the horse's nose and it had been extremely soft, and William Charles said, "I know," and she said, "Not as soft as you think." And they argued about this for a comfortable minute before Margaret Crane appeared from the kitchen with 2 cups of warm milk, and the efficient authority of a woman who has managed both horses and children, and finds the skill sets largely transferable. Outside, the October stars came out one by one over the Kansas prairie, the same stars that had been over this land for all of time and would be over it long after everyone here was gone. And Timothy Norris put his arm around his wife, and she put her hand over his, and the night settled in around them with all the completeness of a thing that is, simply and irrevocably, right.